Hi everyone, welcome back to this series on how to, or ideally how not to, raise a narcissist. So I want to begin with this. I love you. Common sentence. I love you is supposed to be a complete sentence. Not I love you if, or I love you when, especially when you say it to a child. Now, I love you, telling someone I love you, doesn't mean that you necessarily approve of a person's behavior. You can say I love you. Your behavior isn't acceptable, and I love you. But when we're talking about children, a child needs to know that they are loved, and then at the same time, they learn that recognize that perhaps their behavior is unacceptable. And for parents, it's a real balancing act to do both, but it's something we all need, and most of us did not get. All of us are lovable. Most of us make mistakes. All of us make mistakes, and we remain lovable. Children need to know they are loved, and yet most of them hear, I love you, when you, I love you, if. So this series on how to, or how not to, raise a narcissist really gets at a lot of the potential origins of narcissism. There is no one singular pathway, and this series is meant to show the many, many different multi-determined ways we land at this not so pleasant place of narcissism. Before I continue with this, please consider subscribing to this channel. It means a lot to me. It means all this work is actually reaching people, helps this channel grow and reach more people, which actually benefits all of us. The more people who get narcissism, the more people are going to know how to manage it and hopefully not enable it. And if you like it, listen to it. Give it that thumbs up, because a little validation goes a long way for me. Now, when love is really conditional, this puts a person at risk, potentially, for developing a narcissistic personality. So like all of these various pathways of origin we're talking about in this series, many of you are thinking, okay, that's interesting, Dr. Ramani. I got nothing but conditional love when I was growing up. The I love you when, or the I love you if. And now you reflect on the fact that you're actually quite empathic and that you got harmed by the narcissistic folks. And by the way, I think far more of us got conditional love than unconditional love. Unconditional love, sadly, is a pretty rare space. So none of these pathways to narcissism are absolutes. They're risk factors. Some of these things can happen to people. They wind up narcissistic in adulthood. Some of these things happen to people and they actually end up being vulnerable to the narcissist. In fact, I do believe that people who miss out on unconditional love are actually at risk for being harmed by narcissistic relationships in adulthood. But let's talk a little bit about unconditional love and conditional love and how this may play out in the development of narcissism. Now, this concept of unconditional love is actually originally called unconditional regard, and it comes from the work of humanistic theorists such as Carl Rogers. Now, folks who use this humanistic model have a very positive view of human nature. In fact, I would say that most humanists would not like what I have to say about narcissism, since it isn't very nice or very positive. A humanist would actually argue that a narcissistic person probably had too many what are called conditions of worth placed on them. So you may be wondering, what's a condition of worth? A condition of worth is a condition, it's this idea that in order to be deemed worthy or lovable, a person has to earn love by meeting those conditions. For example, by doing what another person wants, or being what another person wants, or giving another person what they want. You have to earn it, right? So thus, the person's sense of self ends up getting shaped by what the world wants for them and wants from them, rather than developing as someone whose authentic, genuine self is enough. Now, it would be interesting to see if you want to drop a comment, if this is relevant to you, if looking back, you were able to identify relationships in which other people placed conditions on your worth. Now, in the humanistic model, all human beings are viewed as having the potential for something called self-actualization. Now, self-actualization is hot Consider self-actualization to be the very top, the summit of the psychological mountain. And to get there means that a person has to be authentic, fully formed, deeply genuine, empathic, comfortable in your own skin, and to recognize yourself as worthy of love. Not in an immature manner, but that you recognize your own sense of self-worth and have no need to dominate anyone with any of that. To be capable of, people who are self-actualized are capable of giving unconditional regard and are aware of their strengths and vulnerabilities. Personally, I actually believe that the opposite of narcissism is self-actualization. So if we use these humanistic theories, the argument could be made that narcissistic adults may very well have had conditions of worth placed on them as children. They learned and experienced that love was conditional. You get loved only if you get grades. You only get loved if you do what the parent wants, look the way the parent wants, make the family look good. And here is where intergenerational cycles come into play. The more narcissistic a parent is, the more conditional they tend to be in all relationships, including with their own children. And the more likely they are to raise either children who are narcissistic or children who are very vulnerable to the manipulation of narcissistic people. So ultimately, conditional love, being told I only love you under certain conditions, doesn't get anyone to a good place. Now, the challenge for narcissistic adults is the need to constantly look to the outside world to regulate, to get feedback, to at some level almost confirm that they exist. This is it's a core issue for narcissistic people, and it magnifies their vulnerability, their shame, and their rage. So it makes sense that getting the message of conditional worth or conditional love early in life for a person who goes on to become narcissistic was a real setup for this. As I said, it tends to be a fork in the road. Some people who experience these conditions of worth, which, like I said, is probably most of us, tend to feel anxious. We tend not to fully possess our sense of worth, and we can be vulnerable to self-devaluation and invalidating ourselves, and we can be vulnerable to narcissists. While other people who get conditional love are at risk for relying on the external regulation style that is seen in narcissism. Now, unconditional positive regard, just being loved, leaves a child feeling secure, with a well-developed sense of self and the ability to withstand and regulate frustrations such as disappointment and failure without falling down and feeling like, oh, I failed, so now I'm not lovable. So upon hearing all of this, you may be wondering, what can a parent do, or anyone who is with young children? Number one, never tell them you would love them if, or love them when, or I love you but. Just I love you. Stop. The child needs to experience love free from any conditional setup. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't call them out on their behavior or ever voice disapproval. If they are behaving badly, then that gets addressed. But it's never because they're behaving badly that you say, well, I don't love you anymore. Love should not be contingent on behavior. We can love a person and step away from them. Those are two different issues. Number two, be clear on the difference between your child and the behavior. When we call a child out, it should be on the behavior, not saying to them, oh, you're such a bad kid, but rather, it's not okay to hit your sister. The first statement, oh, you're such a bad kid, invalidates the entire child. The second statement, focusing on them hitting their sibling, helps the child see that a behavior is a problem. It's a fine point, but it's an important one. Number three, and this is a theme from other videos in this series, yes, as parents, we want to celebrate our children's accomplishments and the things that they are good at. But don't leave them feeling that that's the only thing interesting or lovable about them. Get to know and appreciate or understand everything about them. Games they like, interests they have, things they collect, shows they want to watch, people they know, opinions they hold, feelings they have, all of that. Show an interest in the whole child. That helps them build up that strong internal resolve, so they're less externally reliant and then less likely to become narcissistic. Number 4, be careful with how you joke with them. We sometimes think, oh, they know I don't mean it when I say these things. No, they don't know that. When you say, oh, if you don't go empty that dishwasher or you don't go set the table, I'm going to love you a little less. Ha ha ha. Maybe you can get away with that once. But even if you have a dark sense of humor, don't play with that in someone's childhood. Wait until adulthood and they have a fully formed sense of self and a sense that they're lovable. And then if you want to say, I may not love you unless you empty that dishwasher, you'd like to think at that point they could withstand it, but not when they're a child. Number 5, try to watch how you talk about regrets about your own life with your child. For example, things like, if only I had waited to have you later, my life would have been a lot easier. Listen, that may be absolutely true, but share those thoughts and musings with your friends, therapist, anyone but them. In fact, this may even be a meaningful conversation when your child is an adult. But these kinds of musings on the different choices you could have made in your life that involve them can feel very much like a conditional space to them, and may leave them wondering if your life would have been better or easier or whatever without them. Children often blame themselves, or typically blame themselves, for everything, including any setbacks that you have. So please drop a comment if anything I've said here sort of makes sense to you in sort of understanding what a parent can do, or anyone, teachers, anyone else who is involved in the lives of younger children, to make sure a child feels unconditionally loved. Now, even as Carl Rogers and other humanistic folks wrote this stuff, they knew that at some level it was aspirational. None of us get any of this right every time. I have made every mistake many times on this list myself. The issue is how often, how pervasive. The goal is for us as parents to catch it. The fact is that most of us didn't get unconditional love in childhood, and most of us don't get it in adulthood when relationships become even more transactional and more conditional. Conditions of worth and conditional regard, when they happen enough, do not end up getting anyone into a good place. Either they are a setup for narcissism or for the vulnerabilities that make us more malleable and manipulatable by the narcissistic folks out there. So none of these are particularly good destinations. So to avoid these traps around conditional love with children, as a parent, it really is about mindfulness. We have to pay attention to everything we say or do. We have to pay attention to our language, to how we are with them, to be present with them. And frankly, the same rules apply in adulthood and adult relationships. We can do our very best to try to be unconditional in those relationships as well. So these conditions of worth always take us down unhealthy pathways. And if you're in the process of raising children, please catch it. And even if it's with other adults, there is a power to knowing this, because I think that even in adulthood, there's extraordinarily possibilities when people feel unconditionally loved. I'm also going to throw one other kind of comment out there, which is this idea of self-actualization, because I know more than a few are thinking, oh, I want to get to the top of that mountain. That sounds like it sounds really cool up there at self-actualization. It's a journey. It's never a place. Like, you don't get to self-actualization and pull up a lounge chair and put your feet up. It's a daily commitment to that. I got to tell you, in my whole life, I think I've probably met 2, maybe 3 self-actualized people, and it's just like a perfect spring day when you're with them. They're so on it, and they're very different kinds of people. Most of them were older. And I do think that there's something about the journey of life that gets someone there. But I'd have to say the word there is serenity. And we really get there by doing the work. And that work may be in therapy. It might be the work that comes from meditation. It really, really, though, comes from pulling ourselves away from all of these conditions of worth, understanding who we are in the world, and in many ways, breaking ourselves from societal messages that tell us we have to own this, we have to do this, that our value comes from where we live and what we drive and what we wear and all of that. That's a really, really tough mountain to climb. It's aspirational. And like I said, sometimes we get there and we get pulled back. We get there, we get pulled back. But I think it is possible for all people. It also means that you self-actualize, you leave people behind. It really is a journey to getting to this place. And to get to that place, you do have to remove the voices in your life that are full of conditions, who are telling you that in their subtle ways that you're not enough, and who may not want you to leave them behind. So self-actualization ain't an easy trip. But for those of you who are interested in it, please read the work of Carl Rogers, because he really gets into it. And if any of you get there, please send a postcard from self-actualization, because I'd love to hear how that feels. I ain't near it yet. And if you like this video, self-actualized or not, please give me a thumbs up. And as always, tune in, subscribe, and look forward to giving you more content tomorrow.